The situation in Ukraine takes a turn for the worse after a truce between the government and opposition leaders falls apart. At least 70 people are now dead and hundreds hurt as the government continues its crackdown on protesters. Today, the European Union voted to impose sanctions on some Ukrainian officials responsible for the violence. Yesterday, President Obama threatened consequences, but John Bolton doesn't think his words amount to much.
He calls on the government not to resort to violence, and then in the next sentence, he calls on the demonstrators to be responsible. So he's showing moral equivalence, government, demonstrators, sort of all the same thing. Much the same way as in August of 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, he called on both the Russian side and the Georgian side to exercise restraint. The likes of Vladimir Putin see that behavior and they say the field is open.
And with President Putin's fingerprints all over the current chaos, a lot of people, though, are looking at the United States' role, and we have this look back of 2009.
I think we have an excellent opportunity to reset the relationship between the United States and Russia.
To paraphrase President Obama, it's time to press the reset button.
We want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay?
Prop comedy doesn't ever work. George Will had thoughts about this last night. We thought that was worth playing, and then we're going to kick it around the table.
Kick it.
We're seeing in Ukraine what we've seen in Syria and what we'll see again in Iran is a complete failure of what I think was the centerpiece of the president's foreign policy, and that is the reset of relations with Russia. Putin is obviously bolstering the government in Ukraine. The question then is, what are we getting? Is this a completely sterile policy?
Greg, this afternoon, the Pentagon said that Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel has been trying all week to try to reach the Ukrainian defense minister, but his calls either are not being taken and they're certainly not being returned. So what should America do at this point if no one's even going to listen?
I think the game is over for America. I think the game is over because our guy chose not to play. If you look at Iran, you look at Syria, you look at Snowden, these are all trifles when you're busy tweeting about binge-watching House of Cards or congratulating an athlete who's come out as gay, which are all noble things. But in the world of priorities, Obama is more like a publicist for Us Weekly than a president. And when you put a community organizer up against ex-KGB, this is what happens. But more important, how do you represent American interests when you don't, in fact, like them? Here's the question. Do you really think a young Obama in his 20s during the Cold War thought we were the good guys? Do you really believe that? Hell no.
Well, maybe
the bad
not,
guys
but maybe
won.
In his 30s he changed his mind.
Perhaps.
Evolved. There's some tremors.
I got Bob mad on that one.
Like was tremoring.
Eric, one of the things that the United States and the EU can do that would not involve troops or military or anything like that is the threat of sanctions against government officials in Ukraine. Can that have a substantial effect quickly enough to stop some violence?
I'm guessing not, only because Russia said no. Here's what we could do. First of all, it's not our war. It's not our problem. It's none of our business. We should stay out of it. I think that what the EU is trying to do, and what we should try to do, is force Ukraine into an early election. Let them go ahead and push. Let them start their election process early rather than later. That may calm the protesting down. But when I say force, I don't mean military force. I mean diplomatic force. I mean sanctions if you want, if the sanctions mean holding back aid that you may have added to them or
that's personal against that, like, for example, the president of Ukraine's bank account. Or preventing him from being able to, like, the individuals.
Fine. You know what? Fine. Those are above my pay grade. All I care about is not putting some, boots on the ground. Look, we have a war on poverty. We have a war on women. We have a war on race here in America. We're pretty darn busy.
But Bob, to Eric, so Eric has a point that I think a lot of Americans would agree. We don't have any role in this fight. But there is history that would say, what would Poland look like today if America had made that decision in the 80s?
Well, can I just give you props?
Yeah, sure.
Yesterday, you said that truce wasn't going to last long. It lasted about 15 minutes after you said it, so that was a good call on your part.
Now that Putin's been embarrassed in any event, but look, the Ukraine, as I also mentioned yesterday, is critical for Putin's strategy, which is to put together the old Warsaw Pact Soviet Union, and he has to have the Ukraine to do that for a lot of different reasons. We don't need to get into them. But I listened to Josh Bolton, who barely left a mark at the, or Josh Bolton, that'll tell you what I need, who barely left a mark at the UN, and George Will, who says this is a failure of the American policy, and he talks about Iran, Syria, and the Ukraine. And he connects it to the Soviet Union. What would George Will have him do? You see, it's easy to be critical about these things. It's easy to make fun, like Greg does, of a community organizer. But this is not a very clear situation. You all didn't want us to go into Syria. I happen to want us to go and bomb Syria.
Don't look at me and say that.
A lot of people did. You and I were there on that. But
away.
Also, what can we do with Ukraine? I think Eric's right. There's very little we can do because the one thing that goes through their country is gas, and we can't cut that off. We can't sanction that. Who's got the biggest threat here? The EU has the biggest threat because they depend on the energy. And so they need to come up with a list of sanctions if there's such a thing. I'm not sure there is.
But you don't sound like you don't think it's so workable or that we can have
I do not believe it's working. I don't believe anybody, Ronald Reagan or anybody else, could have done anything about it. And here's the other last point I'll make. That Russia still presents to us the one leverage we have against the Chinese. And I have always believed the Chinese to be the single biggest threat to the United States. The Russians have never gotten close to the Chinese. They still could be playing a role in keeping the Chinese from trying to dominate the European, the Pacific theater.
But the problem, Bob, is our relationship with Russia is not good. It has continued to deteriorate.
When was it good?
Hold on. As has our positions in the Middle East. There seems to be a tremendous amount of unrest and a number of countries now that are destabilized. We don't seem to be able to get a hold on it. They don't seem to actually even care if we issue sanctions or care what we have to say. That's what's problematic to me, is our position in the world to have the ability to effectuate good, to be able to help other people, to be able to secure our positions here, doesn't seem to be in any way as strong.
Nor has it been for 30 years.
Well, we did actually.
I disagree with that.
We did win the Cold War. Let's not forget that. And we have a president right now who's obsessed with global warming, obsessed with 1 degree of an increase over a century, while the whole planet literally is on fire. There's actual global warming going on right now in Venezuela, in Syria, in the Ukraine.
Right.
That the temperatures are high, and he's worried about 1 degree Celsius. And again, I go back to electing a grad student. He'd rather save a whale than himself and than his people. He's like a housekeeper vacuuming his home while it's on fire.
Well, that happened at my house one time.
Let me read to you something that Ron Paul, former presidential candidate, said. He said that the American people are very leery of getting involved in another squabble in some other country. I would be willing to wager most of the people in Ukraine would like to see the United States stay out, and they'd like to see the Russians stay out. The problem with that I have is that that's just not reality. The Russians are going to be there. So we have Ukrainians who like the Western lifestyle. They've been able to travel. They've said, "Wow, it's so much better."
They want to embrace
to be free. They like the shop. They like to do the shopping.
We're
they like
their
all the freedom.
Right.
They're other inspiration. So if we're not going to be there, and Russia is, have we just ceded that ground?
Yeah, but Russia controls the economic levers of the Ukraine. We do not.
Not necessarily.
Oh, yes, they do. They've got to give them $15
Ukraine
billion.
is more than just a pipeline through the country. Ukraine, it has substantial production. They have a substantial economy that isn't just Russian oil, gas that goes
like
to
Most of them are exported to Russia.
It has agriculture. It has other, and they're becoming more and more.
We're at a strategic and geographic disadvantage.
Do we have to be the world's? Every time a group that wants democracy is pushed back by someone who wants it less. Do we have to be the arbiter? Do we always have to be the arbiter?
There's nobody else.
No, but not only the arbiter. Do we have to be the military arbiter? That's my question.
I mean, is there anybody that has said that there should be military assets used?
Not at this table.
I don't know of anybody that has.
I just want to have a leader. That's all I'm asking, Bob.
What do you think will happen if you had? Let's say you take Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
What do you think Ronald Reagan would do about the Ukraine right now?
I think, you know what? It wouldn't have happened because Putin would have respected Ronald Reagan. He really does. He understands that President Obama is interested in fighting a domestic revolution, not foment any kind of international democracy. He's interested in cleaning the problems of past regressions of a bad America within its boundaries. Outside of America, he doesn't care.
You could say that Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War, which is ridiculous.
Why is that ridiculous?
Because a lot of presidents before that led up to it, particularly including the nuclear weapons that were placed in Europe by the United States, and they knew that they couldn't deal with it.
Jimmy Carter did it. The strategic
what Ronald Reagan did was he put 2,000 troops in Lebanon, got more Marines killed in one single day than anybody else, and turned out. But I'll give you this: Reagan did invade grenaded and saved 400 rich American students.
All right.
That was good.
Hey, Bob, here's what you just said.
Oh,
You
my
said
goodness.
Ronald Reagan
That's all he did,
didn't win the Cold War.
it.
Meanwhile, there was that we had a 30-year Cold War going back and forth. When Ronald Reagan developed SDI, whether it was real or not, Strategic Defense Initiative, that is what happened when they decided, you know what, enough is enough. And Ronald Reagan dissolved the Soviet Union. So this wouldn't be going on.
Are you really saying that?
Yeah.
You're saying Ronald Reagan dissolved?
And
you think
the Russians will tell you that.
With
The Russians will tell you that.
No,
History will tell you that.
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia.
Gorbachev will say that, but most intelligent Russians will not say that. It was accumulation, not the least of which was the mobile MIRV weapons the United States put in, and the Russians couldn't keep up with them.
Well, one thing that President Reagan, I think, could have done is because he had such good personal relationships with many leaders around the world to be able to do something and in fact call upon the UN, who at that time, to actually do something and speak with one voice. Right now, unfortunately, you have the U.S. and the EU kind of hanging out there by themselves as the only ones who are willing to stand up on the side of freedom.
I think you make a great point, because there's a leadership vacuum right now. That's the problem. If President Obama, and I wish he was in the position to exercise some influence, some respect throughout the world, especially when it comes to these matters, then perhaps people would listen. Then perhaps lives could be saved and we wouldn't be in this situation. I'm just telling you. Look, Bob.
I'm still asking
Clinton
for one
is
of you
better
to come
at
up with a
it
specific
than Obama.
answer
All right.
to this.
Well, okay.
What's the question?
The question is, what would you do? What would a big leader do? Give a Republican leader your best
exactly
one
what
you want.
Obama's doing right now. I think he's handling perfectly. What do you think of that?
I think he's doing everything diplomatically.
I think what the sound bites that you saw in this segment, I think they were saying that there are consequences for a lack of a clear policy with Russia, and also the red line situation in Syria has had basically like a ripple effect all around the world, and that's their point of view.
And their point of view is Bolton and George Will. Now, come on, is there one person that we put up here who actually thinks reasonably in geopolitical terms that's not a right-winger?
Let's just look at what's going on around the world. We're focusing on the Ukraine. Meanwhile, Venezuela is on fire, which is closer to us. What
about Syria?
I thought we disliked the jerks who are in power, who hurt the press and arrest dissenters. Liberal activists only speak out against injustices if they perceive it as America. That's it. That's why nobody cares.
Did one thing change when Chavez...
Look at Venezuela.
Did one thing change when Chavez was in?
What do you mean?
Got worse.
But what did work? Well, he died.
Starving people, high crime rate.
No, but what did the United States able to do about it? What was their ability to do about it?
Well, the guy blames everything on America.
I know he blamed it, but what did the United States able to do about it?
He said that we gave him cancer, remember?
Yeah, I don't believe that the Bush administration could have done more than they did. I don't believe anybody else could.
I mean, what are you trying to say?
What I'm trying to say is this idea of American leadership, you could isolate it and say it in the Cold War, when the world was divided between East and West, that you might make a sensible argument about. But when you've got all these different countries with all these different geopolitical issues, and to suggest that the United States somehow could have a, quote, leader that's going to change these things is absolutely
But, Bob, you can't
juvenile.
deny the fact that this perfect storm of chaos and instability has occurred under his not watchful administration.
We have to wrap, guys. All right.